Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. And we are going to go straight to our topic, which is the activism and politics of urban space. And our keynote for tonight is Elke Krasny. And I'm not going to introduce you to her in the way that it's available on her website, because it's like 3 pages. We would have been sitting here till midnight. And so I'm going to say that she's a curator, a cultural theorist and writer, a professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And her theoretical and curatorial work is rooted in socially engaged art, spatial practices, urban epistemology, post-colonial theory, and feminist historiography. Elke Krasny, the floor is yours, and our topic is actually derived from the text that you wrote for the Atlas, and it's about politics, activism and politics of urban space.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to come here and speak here tonight. I want to say thank you to Helena for including me in the book. It's really wonderful. So I see it for the first time today, and I look forward to reading it and to sharing it with my students. And I also want to say thank you to all the people at the Goethe-Institut who made it possible with complex itineraries that I'm actually here tonight. So I would like to speak about sharing first from an experiential and more phenomenological point of view, and then about political and ethical concerns. And I think very often when people say, I'm happy to share this with you, it's an announcement that makes us feel as if sharing we're always something happy. And of course, very often the things that are shared with us do not make us happy, or we would have been happier if they hadn't been shared with us. So what I want to get at is the contradictions, the conflicts, and the paradoxes that come with sharing. So what do we actually share with each other? We could say we share a secret, and strictly speaking, when we have shared a secret, it's no longer a secret. So we have to think what sharing does in the way that it makes something no longer one's own. We could say we share a conversation, but of course when we share the conversation, what you understand and what I understand might be very different things. So even though we shared the conversation, we might not necessarily hold the same memories, the same beliefs, the same set of understandings with it. And this could go on for quite a while. So we understand that sharing has to do with immaterial things, but it also has to do with material things, as we have learned. We share meals, we share space, we share all kinds of things all the time, whether we like it or not. Those of you who live with children or animals know that they share all the time without even asking. The younger they are, the more they take for granted that their sharing comes first. So I shared, I think, my bed with my children for many years, and I never wanted to. I mean, they took it for granted that this is shared territory. So to define what is being shared and what is not being shared is both a very practical but also a very political question. So we could move from our apartments and our meals to shared histories, which we don't consider in the same way, and also to what has already been part of the conversation, to a planet we share. And we all know that this planet is not in a very, is not feeling well. And it's the reason for this is how we shared the resources this planet has to offer us, so emphasis on has to. So in this sense, even though it's quite correct that sharing could be understood as a new paradigm, I think it also comes with a lot of very complicated negotiations, contradictions, and a field for political intervention, both with big P and with small p. In 1976, Raymond Williams, Marxist cultural theorist, wrote a book called Keywords, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society. And then this book was updated in the 21st century by Bennett, Grossberg, and Morris, and they wrote Keywords for our time. But I think a lot of keywords are actually missing, and sharing is one of the keywords that is missing from the book. But there are others like climate change, resilience, sustainability, environmental grief. So all the things that are actually really pertinent today seem to be missing from their keywords. So I think this is a task that we maybe collectively have to share with each other what the keywords for our cities and for our collective and not impossible survival would be, in order to not only reflect better, but arrive at practices and at working together. So I think what I also would like to share with you is that, of course, I'm not speaking my mother language tonight. So Europeans share a language that soon nobody will speak except for the people in Malta and in Ireland. My mother language is the language my mother shared with me, and that's German. And teilen, so the word that prompted the reflections, actually mean two very different things. They mean to share, as we understand it in English, but it also means divide, which is something quite different. And so I think what this helps me to think about is that we are divided over what we share. And I think this is the political starting point to think about the premise of sharing. So we are divided over this, but we are also divided about how to share, with whom to share, when to share, and who should define that. So these divisions that are shared divisions, if one will, necessitate an ethical orientation in this world in which, with the arrival of Facebook in 2004, activities like commenting, liking, and sharing have started to not only define digital intersubjectivity, but also, I think, lived practices and the subjectivities as we share them. And the last point I wanted to bring to our discussion here is this other very economic terminology that is connected to sharing. The shareholder or the share owner, so the person who has a share in a company. And I think that we live in a time where people think, or many of them think they have or they don't have a share in their city, a share in their state, a share in their working place, where the neoliberalization of the mind has led us to believe that we are shareholders rather than political subjects or participants. And this is something that I find profoundly troubling, and I hope that we can discuss it in such a way that we are not despairing with each other when having this conversation here.
Thank you very much. To share with us this ambiguities of the term and practice of sharing. And I would like to move it maybe to this level of the urban space, because in your text for the Atlas, you're relating to the urban space a lot, and you're telling the story of establishing the urban space and links to nationalism, which is quite interesting, how to perform the nationality in the urban space. And I think it is one of the topics that we had already at the end of the first discussion, because we are in a way in times when the renationalization of the urban space is taking place. So I would like to go to this part of the text of yours in the atlas and ask you about the possibility of a solution for it. You're talking about a caring activism. What is actually caring activism, in your opinion? How should we understand it?
I think it's always very hard to be asked to share solutions. So I think solutions are not shared by one single person, but they are worked toward collectively. The example I chose at the beginning of the text is that one of the institutions of the modern nation state that was formed in the 19th century was the museum, but there were other such institutions like the garden, the public garden, or the park, or the playground. And there is a very specific way of understanding that this museum institution as a public institution of the nation state was actually meant as a site where this ritual of citizenship was being performed. But at the time when during the French Revolution, when the Louvre was actually opened to the public, women and people who didn't have a white skin were actually not able to hold citizenship. And nonetheless, they were expected to also participate in this ritual of citizenship. So celebrating those and the culture of those who were citizens, but not actually having the title of citizenship. And so I think this example offers a number of ways to think about that. On one hand, it makes very clear that the public spaces that are being shared are shared by people that are not having the same rights and that are not necessarily similar to each other. But it also opens ways to think about instituent practices of citizenship, or what Saskia Sassen has called emergent citizenship, so that people who are actually not holding legally a passport of a country can actually practice a lot of the practices that citizens practice. And this is where caring activism comes in. So there are many different practices we could think about. But taking care of public spaces collectively can be done by a lot of people who belong legally, who belong emotionally, who belong traditionally, who belong because of their own choosing. And if they choose to care together in the sense of taking care of the environment, of maintaining its existence, but also making it accessible socially to those who form part of not closed, but potentially porous community that allows for others to gain access, that was already mentioned by Peter and Helge, then I think it's the kind of care that doesn't close off, but actually becomes hospitable and maybe provides public spaces as spaces where hosting can take place. And I don't want to sound kitschy, but I think it's a political proposition and not a sentimental one.
Mm-hmm. Szilvia Zsargo, you're a founder of Mindspace, and as you say about yourself, you enjoy transforming your professional experience and strategic knowledge to real-life projects and actions. And you're interested in gamification and this transfer from non-formal education tools to and to this involvement of citizens, which we are actually talking about. And you have like two diplomas from the TU in Budapest, an engineering manager, which I find very interesting, a specialist in environmental management, and as an industrial designer. And you've been involved in many EU projects. And now when we hear about this activism and about the environment that you have to work in, these shrinking spaces being actually taken over by the national state, so the less and less citizenship can be exercised in the public space. So my question to you is actually about the activism and the sustainability of activism in as an agent of change in this public space. Is it possible? Because when we think about activism, it's an action, it's performing, and what is the sustainability of your actions as a citizen, as a founder of Mindspace?
Yes, the question is really tricky because I think in some ways it is sustainable because it's kind of in your genes. When you're an activist, you want to act forward, to bring things forward and for your environment, for your city. But in some ways, it's totally not sustainable to do it in the same way all the time. So for us with Mindspace, I think the essence was always the same, like making the city a nicer place, but sometimes the focus was mobility and biking, sometimes it was the waterfront, sometimes, and within shared cities, it was to revitalize a specific market hall and to try to kind of give a momentum for the local community to make their own community and continue this community thing without us. But I think like doing the same thing all over, it's not sustainable. And of course, financially, you also need some input. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. But on the long run, you cannot just be volunteers and, you know, glitter in the eye, saving the world type of thing. But altogether, if you are an activist type, you will be doing things in different ways.
But how do you relate now? Do you see the change due to the political situation, to the changing political situation? Do you see the change in the way you're forced to act, or you're left the space in which you can act?
Yes, we definitely feel the change because, well, some of you know that we did these activities for more or less 1.5 years within the market hall, and then we were banned from there because this April, because of the European parliamentary elections were coming, and actually next week or in 2 weeks we will have the municipal elections in Budapest. So from one day to the other, Adam just got a call that, oh, from tomorrow you cannot organize community breakfast, plant exchange, many of the activities we did. So, and actually if we look at this project, but if we look at the 10 years of Mindspace, we feel the wind is stronger and stronger against us. So the space is really shrinking and you have to be a lot more, you have to work a lot harder. And we took granted many things when we started. And actually, even those things start to disappear. So you have to work harder to even keep up the same community things.
Matthias Einhoff, you're co-founder and the director of the Center for Arts and Urbanistics, ZKO, in Berlin. And you have like a huge experience in working in interdisciplinary hubs and urban research, and in Skulpturenpark in Berlin, in Sonsbeek, Jakarta Biennial, you were part of it. And what I find very interesting is the wasteland twinning network that you were a part of. What you probably don't know about Matthias, he's a singer as well. He has a band. But we are not going to talk about it now. I do my research. So you're teaching at the UDK Berlin, Universität der Künste in Berlin, and you're a visiting professor at the Kunsthochschule Kassel. Used to be. My question to you is more or less the same as for Szilvia, because you are in a way working with one of the projects that is being described in the Atlas in an opposition to a commercialized space. what all these cities that we are talking about are having together is that there was a void after '89, and the really wild capitalism came and took over this space. It's I know that you have this beautiful picture of Berlin not being this place, but it is. And I think it could be really interesting to have a look at the way that you're trying to really establish a sustainable activism in a place like Berlin. And I'm relating to your furniture, to your work with the small architecture, with the city furniture, and could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'll try. I think activism has a problem with sustainability per se, because it opposes sort of the hegemonial structures that are there, yeah, and sort of if you come into the position that what you are asking for is to be realized, you compromise with the hegemonial structures. And you start to become a collaborator. And that's a problem for an activist, of course, to become a collaborator with hegemonial structures. So actually, that's very often where activism ends. You know, so you have these claims, and actually it produces, I think that David very nicely coined it, you produce a public, a counter-public. So that is happening, but then when it comes to creating this kind of sustainability for your claims, meaning, for example, legal certainty by contracts or, you know, whatever that could create a legal certainty, there often it ends for these reasons that I just mentioned, that you become a collaborator. So in, for example, the project that we're working on right now at the Haus der Statistik, maybe you were referring to that, we are actually in this kind of situation right now. After 3 years of activism, and we had a very strong civil society supporting our claims for various reasons, and we come now to the point where we actually have to compromise with the sort of, you know, the owners of that building, which is the city of Berlin, and we have to find a way to kind of collaborate with them. And suddenly we're alone in the room, and you know, and it's actually not so easy, because you lose your social credibility as an activist, you know, with these strong claims that you had, and then you have to ask yourself, you know, am I gonna sort of switch back to activist mode and not reach the sustainability for my claims, or do I go into this compromise? And I personally, I'm into the sort of, yeah, facilitation of that space where these kind of, say, claims of civil society, and that's what's given by the hegemonial structures, that there is a space in between. I believe in that, and then we can find something that goes beyond that. And that's sort of what where I see myself. So does that answer your question? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, because you're talking about the kind of danger of institutionalization. That you're as an activist, you need an institution to be able to reach a sustainable way of having these claims in the space, in the public space. And could you maybe say a few words about the Haus der Statistik and the way that it's going to work? Because it's a kind of interesting public-private partnership, because you are in the same boat with the municipality of Berlin, and part of the project is a building that is going to be built for the municipality of Berlin, that sold all the plots in Berlin and now is looking for affordable space for itself, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah, I hope not that we end up with a public-private partnership at the very end in the classic 90s model. But what I do hope for is that we reach a level of legal certainty, which we have not achieved yet. And maybe for those who don't know about that project, it's about a kind of centrally located space on the Alexanderplatz in Berlin. It's 60,000 square meters, which used to be the House of Statistics of the former GDR. So it is actually, I was really sort of listening closely to the first discussion about also the heritage of socialist architecture, and there we are sort of confronted with that situation, and also with, you know, all these opposing positions in dealing with that heritage that we have in Berlin, and we've always had ever since the reunification. And now sort of we have a very weird mix of people who, you know, from civil society, who try to make it happen that this building isn't torn down. So you have the kind of socialists, sentimentalists. You have sort of the you know, very progressive vegan activists, and they are teaming up. That was very unusual sort of collaboration. And after these 3 years of activism, now we're at the point we've tried to create a model that could ideally in parts and modules be applied also in other places of how civil society, local administration can work together on developing a sustainable sort of architecture for that area that is not only based sort of on its economic output, but it's also based on its social qualities. And so in a way we're saying it's a model project. We don't know yet if it's a model project because we haven't succeeded, but that's what we like to say.
This collaboration leads me to Ivan Kucina. Ivan, you're a professor at the Dessau International School of Architecture and the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Belgrade. Still or not anymore? Not anymore. Oh, sorry. But what is interesting in the topic of your research is that you focus on sustainable architecture and urban development and the concepts of informal building strategies and participatory practices. And we discussed before, when you hear Matthias and when you hear Szilvia, what is, and especially after the keynote about sharing, we discussed sharing versus collaboration, and we discussed the linguistics that we have in the, I think all over the Central and Eastern Europe, where sharing is actually dividing. More or less. It's in Polish, it's dividing, in Serbo-Croatian probably as well, and in German it's, yeah, it's quite hard. I mean, it's tile and it's exactly the same. So when you hear about these activist practices and in terms from the of your research, where would you see this sharing versus collaboration topic? We should start discussing.
For me, the term collaboration was the way out of the contradictions that sharing brings, because we met that contradiction first time when we had to translate the title of this project to Serbian language, and then we had a problem because it is about dividing. It's completely different, and then the problem was, okay, if it's dividing, then you have this concept that you divide a common resource and then everybody takes a part and goes beyond that, whatever. So we were not really thinking in that direction. So collaboration is something that is actually tightening the connections between the people for the further, for more, in a more proactive sense, for something that will become. And sharing is something that is already done, let's say like that. At least when you get into these problems with translating things into other languages. At that moment I start to use the word collaboration rather than sharing, because it also responds to some other experiences that I had in the projects before. And with collaboration, I think we were all more happy than with the sharing. We also could do more. I think since Matthias is singing in the group, you know, I use the rock group as a model of collaboration, and this kind of proactive collaboration, which actually starts from your own urge without any much reason, your own relationship to the world, that then evolve and have other forms and then becomes more serious and sometimes even more politically engaged. So collaboration is political engagement in that sense. And in Belgrade, the project that we made wanted actually somehow to plant the seeds of collaboration into the place where collaboration seems impossible. Because we, like most of the post-socialist countries, we lost the public trust. And I'm afraid it's very contagious because it starts to happen all around the world. So the first thing we had before starting dealing with even with the public space is to start rebuilding or maybe building a new public trust. And to do that, we need to collaborate. It's very simple. So for us, sharing was maybe a secondary thing at the end, because it's too much brings too much contradiction, and collaboration make it more simple and make it more direct. Of course, I just said the beginning, because then there are other things. It's very complicated.
Yeah, but would you say that the collaboration is an answer to this wave of actually sharing the public space through dividing it and through excluding groups from different groups from sharing it? Because the wave of the populism that we have, it's not only in Europe, it's all over the world. It's a wave of division. It's a wave that when people say who is allowed to participate and who is not allowed to participate, how do you bring it together with this idea of collaboration? How is it an answer to this kind of sharing, which means actually dividing?
Collaboration is the way how to fight the populism, I would say. It's not populism actually operates on some kind of meta level, which is not really dealing with everyday practices, and collaboration do everyday practices. And it's populism is, I would say, the reselling the same old meat again and again, and they're interesting into monumental things, into some kind of big stories. It's very manipulative. Collaboration is not, because for collaboration you have this kind of one-to-one relationships, and in that, of course, you can try to manipulate others, but then you cannot do much about it, because collaboration is directed towards some kind of outcome, and if you want to reach to that outcome, you need to work together. And working together, it means respecting other person, whoever it is. It doesn't matter anymore. So it's not a question of identity. It's more a question of accepting otherness in many faces that it can have. Even if you collaborate with somebody that you completely disagree, but if you manage to do something together and create a new value, a commonwealth, then it's fine.
Yeah, first you have to have the will to collaborate with someone. Elke, you were just frowning. I saw you did. I would like to go further in this because this is kind of like a future we are facing. Basically, it's a reality we are facing. But when we see the trend, it's going to this direction. That there are more divisions and less collaboration. Could you maybe relate to what Ivan was saying?
Well, I was just thinking about where one draws the line. I mean, with whom not to collaborate, and so I mean, I find myself in agreement listening to you when you say the concrete everyday actions that are necessary in order for people to survive and that they share. That is something very fundamental, let's say, and something that has to be redistributed or distributed differently. But then on the other hand, so there's just a new book by Michael Rothberg on perpetrators and victims. So he's a Holocaust scholar who has brought together decolonial scholarship and Holocaust scholarship. And so in a way, how to learn to collaborate. I mean, we could look at yeah, at all kinds of genocidal societies, from Germany to Rwanda to Australia, to understand how those who have been murdered and killed and whose ancestors survive then need to share the same space and the same territory and work out how to coexist or not coexist. And I think this is what I was thinking about. I mean, where do you draw the line? With whom would you not collaborate? Where do you say, I do not want to, neither you, I don't want to share anything with you, not the table, not a conversation, nothing. And I think this is also something that is happening in our society. So I wouldn't want to be forced to always have to share and to always have to collaborate. I would also reserve the right for people to say, this is where I refuse to collaborate. Yeah, so.
Szilvia, to bring it on a activistic level, who would you not like to share with and not to collaborate with?
Good question. I think the very extremists are the ones that are really hard to, but in my ideal mind, I think it's always worth a try. Of course, it's a different situation when your whole family was killed by someone and the right of not wanting to share. But if you think about like our activities in Budapest, like in our generation, not such thing is so vivid by now. But again, of course, there is a lot of, like within the people who you sit next to, a lot of minorities appearing here and there. So, but for me, I think it should be a chance somehow to try to collaborate or at least open our minds towards each other, because if it doesn't happen, then hatred is growing and we repeat the same patterns again and again. But it's a really hard issue, so I don't say it's an easy to tackle.
Yeah. Even from the perspective of a post-traumatic society, how would you say, how would you respond to what Elke was saying?
I see collaboration as the only way out at the moment, because it's I would say it's a kind of saving strategy. Because if we start from the beginning to suspicious the otherness, you know, of course we know what we could expect, but if you cut yourself from the beginning, then we will not have we are losing the power. I think we are losing the energy. Of course, there should be a line, but that line goes again in very simple relationships. So I wouldn't work with someone who is going to steal something from me. You know, it's very simple. I wouldn't collaborate with someone who doesn't want to collaborate with me. I mean, that's let's say like that. I mean, it's at the end it comes to the very simple thing.
It's very biblical,
but,
what you
know,
said.
I think you have, each of us has the experience of collaborating with our partners in the marriage. And I mean, it evolves, you know. So even in the beginning, if you feel that something is working or not working, it could work or not work afterwards, you know. So you always have to give a time. I think collaboration needs time, and it has ups and downs, and, you know, it can repair itself. Of course, you have all these kind of, you know, political structures which are really disgusting, you know, when you think, okay, I have to sit with him, you know, and share the table and talk something with them because I need to bring the, you know, some money into the project for the park. So I have really to sit with somebody that I would never sit, because it's, but then you think, okay, the outcome is more important than even myself.
Okay, let's go back maybe to the activism in this context, because I was wondering, we are talking about activism in a very positive way, as an agent of change towards the more liberal society or more open society. But there are the other activists as well. I mean, there are national activists or nationalistic activists that are actually working in the same space, and they are putting their feet in the door, and they are taking the space, the city space as well. We have it in Germany, we have it in Poland, we have it in Hungary. I assume we have it, I mean, in the US, in Austria. So how do you work with that when the space is contaminated, and how do you work with this contaminated space? Matthias?
All right. Public space to me is an ideal space if it allows for a maximum of plurality. And part of that plurality is also nationalist and other extremist positions. This is part of the public space, and it's there to negotiate these different positions and to see whether they make sense, whether they can gain a majority. As long as you have functioning democratic structures, a strong, robust civil society, this is not a bad thing. And I think it's part of what we have to stand. But there are, of course, limits where there's tipping points, where maybe after you don't have a strong civil society, it's not so robust, and the political sort of structures are altered and democracy is undermined. Then these things become more difficult. But then this is no longer a kind of plural public space. So what I would like to just say that I don't want to I wouldn't say it's contaminated, because people that I don't agree with have been in that space and have voiced their opinion in that space, because I think that is dividing. I think it is about sort of allowing for these voices and making sure that your political structures are, stay robust in a democratic sense.
Yeah, that's from a point of view of a healthy democracy. It's it makes
that's,
sense.
That's what is a prerequisite, no question.
Yeah, but in a way we're not in that ideal situation anymore, and even not in, I mean, even not in Germany, not anymore, not in the local governments, for instance. Szilvia, how do you work with it?
Well, during our activities, we didn't actually have to face such opposition or, you know, really nationalistic, like face-to-face contradiction. In my experience, they usually do counter something. So when there is pride, then there is the nationalist coming. So there is no nationalist, you know, activities just by themselves. They're usually reflecting to something. And with our activities with Mindspace, we always try to like be kind of this community level, kind of smoothing collaboration. So it's something not like below the radar type of activities, but on a global thing, though agreeing with Matthias that it should be like anybody should have a voice, it's getting scarier, especially when violence turns up and it's more happening with nationalist activities. So that's scary.
Ivan? Because you are we talked about the that you would like to have a positive touch to this discussion, and I would love to hear from you about the utopia of how can we work with it.
Yeah, it's 9 o'clock. It's going.
Yeah,
to be
we're
a
going to
party.
finish in 5 minutes.
It's and I don't like to finish conversation with a negative spirit. So my positive outcome from this would be not to take them seriously, really. So it's the way to also somehow dispower them, because they live on our seriousness, and even if we talk negatively about them, they like that also. So they like to be in our mind. So we have to take them out of our mind and do our stuff the way we think we should do it. And then we have to empower those that doesn't have a power to do what they want to do, to work with them together, and then to overcome these people who thinks they're the master of the world. So I see that as the only possibility at the moment, because if we continue talking about them, they will be stronger and stronger.
Yeah, just one quick comment that came to my mind, that I also work as a facilitator with groups and a lot of different projects. And as facilitator, if there is energy with the room, you can deal with it. If there is no energy and passivity, then you have a really, really hard time. But even if it's negative energy, with the facilitation magic, you can actually turn it into working energy. And maybe that's what we should think, how to convert to urbanism.
Okay. Elke, closing word.
Closing words, no, that's terrible. I was just thinking about how to understand better what the shared threats actually are at this given moment in time, and maybe there are threats that are so drastic that they will be more important to be addressed than political questions. So when we think about how the heat is going up, and global warming also statistically means that there will be more violence. So increased violence is statistically connected to increased temperature. And so maybe this is such a shared condition that out of this not yet fully understood scenario of crisis that we will have in the future, a different type of politics might actually arise. So I mean, I'm not quite sure I actually believe what I'm saying, but I try to believe it. I mean, I try to believe it in a sense that one cannot give up to believe this, because if one gives up to believe this, one has already always lost. And I think this is what one cannot allow oneself to do.
That's a very activistic position. Thank you very much. It is a kind of positive note that we have. So I'm quite happy that you stayed with us, and we could share it with you and with the people watching us online. Thank you very much for this evening. And now let's party.